The United States entered World War I reluctantly and at the end of the conflict. But at the beginning, as war exploded across Europe, or as one author put, the thunder across the sea. In the summer of 1914, as Europe descended into war, President Wilson asked the country to remain neutral in mind as well as deed, proclaiming American neutrality and asking Americans to not take a side in the conflict. And as the year passed, as 1914 gave way to 1915 and 1916, and Americans saw the horror of the conflict, many were in stark agreement with his proclamation. There were others, though, from the beginning, like Theodore Roosevelt, that said we should be in this war, we should be helping the Allies fight, but they are only a vocal minority on the sidelines. Most of the nation preferred to sit this one out, especially because of the horrors they saw on the battlefields of Europe. Warfare had changed. And we'll talk about some of the transformation and transforming equipment and technology that changes the face of war forever. Germany had had a plan for the conquest of France, and almost from the beginning of hostilities, the Germans had pulled this plan out and began studying it and refreshing it and updating it for the modern situation. And their traditional plan, devised in the early 1900s, was by Count Alfred von Schlieffen. It was known as the von Schlieffen Plan. Humbly, he called it the von Schlieffen Plan. And it called for the maneuver you see on the map. A strong push on the German right flank, following along the English coast, and whirling around Paris, while pressure on the rest of the Belgian frontier kept the French army occupied. The main thrust would get behind the French lines, bringing the fall of Paris and thus the end of the French. There was one small problem with the von Schlieffen plan. It called for an attack through Belgium. Belgium's neutrality was protected by Britain, so by using this plan and the very tactics it advocated, Germany is going to bring its chief nemesis, Great Britain, into the conflict, and with it also the Belgians. The von Schlieffen plan is predicated on movement, upon speed, and in taking the objectives. But the plan was already outdated even when it was written in the early 1900s. 1904, I believe, was when it was prepared. It was already out of date. Drawing on the use of mechanized warfare, it called for speed, but not realizing that tactics of the day had switched from offensive to defensive tactics, and that the real strength of position lay with the defense. And so the Germans, as aggressors in attacking, have to be worried about the speed of the attack. And probably if they had carried out the original von Schlieffen plan without modification, they would have overpowered the French and won. But see, Germany is fighting a two-front war. It not only has to be worried about France, it has to be worried about Russia on its other side. And while Russia has antiquated material, they have old tactics, even older equipment, Russia has a lot of people, and they're not afraid to use them. And so in worrying about a two-front war, the Germans began robbing Peter to pay Paul, to borrow a phrase. They began pulling divisions from the attack on France and supplementing the divisions that were to slow down and delay the Russians. The original von Schlieffen plan called for, if they faced a two-front war, to knock France out of the war quickly and then transfer those divisions to the east. But the German High Command and the Kaiser became so worried about a Russian invasion from the east, they pulled too many divisions from the initial attack. And so when the assaults were launched in the summer of 1914, it bogged down into trench warfare. And the line you see on the map is, for the most part, where the trenches were established in 1914, that's for the most part where they will be when the war comes to an end. For the entirety of the war, in many instances, the trenches only moved 30, maybe 50 miles one way or the other, and that's it. And so the war stagnates. So as the von Schlieffen Plan is activated and the German divisions push into Belgium, Belgian resistance coupled with the British Expeditionary Force are able to slow down, delay, and stop the attack. Why? Well, primarily because of the use of machine guns. Germany and its Maxim gun, Great Britain and its Lewis gun, France and its Shawshat, when the Americans get in the war and begin using the Shawshat, which was a horrific weapon. It jammed quite frequently, but the Americans called it the Chat-Chat gun. The Americans late in the war will get their own machine gun. Early in the war they used both the British and the French weaponry, but they will get the Browning automatic rifle. The British also pioneered the Vickers, and then the Prussians have the Schwarzlos machine gun. But the machine gun makes antique all block formations. And so what generally happened to slow down an offensive, miles upon miles of a new invention that hadn't been used in the previous war, the Franco-Prussian War, miles of barbed wire would be strung across the oncoming offensive. And as the offensive slowed down and stopped working its way through the barbed wire, machine guns would be set up in interlocking fields of fire and make virtual kill zones. And so the German offensive degenerates into a trench line, and the Allies, by necessity, build their own trenches, and the area between the trenches was known as no man's land. Now, because of this stalemate, and thousands and then millions of men are going to be thrown in mass assaults on enemy positions, whether it be a German attack or a British counterattack, millions are going to die at the hands of the machine gun, the automation of the killing field. Weaponry had outgrown the battlefield, and so long gone are the artillery pieces set in the back of the machine guns, in the back of the position, firing direct line of sight. Now artillery is behind the scenes, miles behind the scenes, sometimes up to 10 miles behind the lines. They'll place their heavy artillery and medium artillery, heavy mortars, lobbing shells on the enemy position to try to soften up the trench line for a breakthrough. The problem with indirect fire is somebody has to report how the shells are falling. And so one of the new technological inventions that is used to break the stalemate is the airplane. And that's not a misspelling, that's what they called it in the day, aeroplane. But the initial invention that you see at the top of the pictures is the spotter aircraft, single and sometimes double seat. Both of these that are on the PowerPoint are double seat spotter aircraft. So you have a pilot and you have an observer behind them with either a camera or some type of binoculars, and as they fly over enemy lines, they watch the fall of shells from their artillery, and they will either communicate via flags from the aircraft, or they will land and report how the shells are falling, if they're short, if they're long, if they're right on target, but they'll observe how the fall of shells is being conducted and indicate any changes that need to be made. These spotter aircraft are extremely important to the use of indirect firing artillery and mortars. So you want to deny your opponent the airspace. And someone gets the bright idea that if that plane can carry an observer, why couldn't that observer also carry a rifle? So the initial stages of fighter combat were pilots flying an aircraft either with a rifle or with an observer with a rifle and taking shots at enemy scouts and spotter aircraft. And then someone gets the wise idea of taking the machine guns they're using on the battlefield and applying them to the aircraft, either on the upper wing or on the fuselage. The Germans, especially on the fuselage, develop an interrupter gear so that the machine gun firing is timed with the propeller spinning so that the bullets fire between the spinning propeller. The Allies at first try that, but they don't have an interrupter gear that really works very well. So they armor plate the propeller, and as they fire the machine gun, every now and then you would get a ricochet that hits the propeller and bounces back into the pilot, which is not good for keeping the plane in the air with a wounded pilot or dead pilot. Planes with dead pilots usually crash. But the fighter aircraft armed with some type of weaponry to take out the enemy scouts. And then the natural development is another fighter plane to stop the enemy's fighter planes from shooting down the scouts. And all through World War I, the fighter craft tend to revolve around very specific missions. Denying the airspace to enemy scouts and spotters, and then also the next development, denying the airspace to enemy bombers. Someone gets the bright idea of, well, you're watching artillery fall on these trench lines. Well, why not have the pilot or the observer as they fly over those trench lines to drop some type of explosive device out of the cockpit? So the initial bomber was simply a fighter plane with a bag of hand grenades or hand bombs, dropping them on enemy troops. The problem with that is you generally have to fly, to hit anything, you have to fly fairly low, which puts you in range of rifle fire coming back up, and bad things usually happen. So someone devises the idea of a self-contained bomb that can be dropped from the bottom of the aircraft, and hence the dedicated bomber is developed. Or, in the case of the Germans, they specialized immediately before the war and during the war, the use of massive airships called Zeppelins. Unlike today's, I saw the other day, I think it was Goodyear advertising the Goodyear blimp. When I was a kid growing up, we used to drive by the hangar outside of Houston where the Goodyear blimp was housed, and you would see it flying over the skyline of Houston every now and then. That was a baby compared to these massive Zeppelins that were incredibly large and could carry a fairly substantial payload. And the Germans employed them as a battlefield weapon, but less a battlefield weapon as opposed to a terror weapon for British cities. And so the Zeppelin would fly over in the outskirts of London because all of these royal families are connected. The Kaiser ordered no direct attacks on the heart of London because he didn't want to endanger his cousin, the King of England. So no direct attacks because it might hit the royal family. But, the commoners out living in the suburbs, hey, they're fair game. So the Zeppelins attacking targets throughout Britain, usually at night because Zeppelins are exposed and they're massive aircraft. They could take a fairly substantial amount of damage in the start of the war. Later in the war, as the Allies developed incendiary and explosive bullets, the Zeppelin became less and less effective. But it was a highly useful tool at the start of the war. And then, of course, at the bottom you see observation balloons. Both sides used observation balloons. This is to aid artillery, and usually they would have some type of radio or telegraph device in the balloon. it would be winched up behind your lines, but high enough to see across no man's land into the opposing forces' lines and see where the artillery's falling, where troops are being massed, so that you can direct your defensive capabilities or your offensive capabilities in the case of artillery. So one of the targets of the fighters became shooting down the enemy observation balloons. And especially when the Americans enter the war, there are some American pilots that their specialty is shooting down observation balloons. And generally, observation balloons were very expensive to maintain and operate. And when they would see enemy fighters coming, they would, give direction to the ground crew to winch the balloon down and to get it out of the air so it wouldn't be shot down. But always the observer in the basket of the observation craft would wear a parachute, and when enemy fighters were sighted, he would jump out of the observation balloon and parachute to the ground because you're just a sitting duck with no really capability of returning fire in that observation balloon. So the airplane was the first major attempt to break the stalemate of the trench line, and it opened up a whole new realm of warfare that had never existed before. So the machine gun and barbed wire lead to the use of the airplane, and even though the airplane had been around before the war, its application to military becoming more clear as the war progresses. When the airplane doesn't break the stalemate, the European powers will turn to poison gas. And what you see in the landscape picture is clouds of poison gas being released from poison gas launchers, and that's what they're refilling. They're putting those tubes in the ground. They're putting canisters of poison gas. Initially, it was just a tearing agent, like tear gas, that would just inhibit the enemy's ability to see and breathe and send them into coughing fits. But as that proved ineffective, each side began using more and more deadly forms of gas, mustard gas and phosgene gas, etc., that in many instances would just turn your lungs to goo, and you would cough up your lungs. If your eyes were exposed, it would blind you, and in some instances the poison gas would just erode the wet tissues, any wet tissue that was exposed. And so poison gas became a part of warfare. In fact, it became such a deadly, effective, and fearful tactic that after World War I, they outlaw poison gas. And one of the few restrictions that both sides generally abided by in World War II. They didn't really employ gas after the horrors of World War I. Whole units of men blinded or lungs eroded because of the poison gas, and just horrific. And so countermeasures had to be developed, specifically the use of gas masks, both for the men and their animals, horses and dogs that were there on the front lines, using these gas masks to keep them alive. Poison gas, to detect poison gas, usually you could tell by the sound a shell made as it went overhead whether an artillery deployed poison gas. If the shell made that particular hollow sound as it went overhead, it usually had gas rather than explosives. But in case they couldn't see the release of gas, most units started keeping birds, canaries and the like, in cages in the trench line because they're more highly susceptible to the gases. And if the bird suddenly fell over in the cage and died, you knew to get your gas mask on because you had a very limited amount of time. In its initial use, the gas proved effective in opening up holes in the trench line, but the hole was quickly contained, and the gas, while killing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, just really didn't prove to be the breakthrough weapon that would end the stalemate. And so they turned to a new device. The British were really the pioneers, if you will, of tank tactics. Tank actually being the code name for the tank. JFC Fuller and others theorizing that an armored vehicle of some type was necessary. The British tank on the screen goes through a number of generations, the Mark I through the Mark V, I believe, by the end of the war. And they're usually classified as I show there, a male tank or a female tank. The male tank had, as you can see in the sponson off of the side, and there would be one on the other side, that's the main armament. And it's a 6-pound artillery piece on each side. That means it fires a 6-pound shell. The British male tanks had 2 6-pounders plus supporting machine guns. The female tank didn't have the artillery piece. It was just equipped with machine guns, Vickers or whichever types of machine guns they had. Usually they put 2 different types in the tank, a Hotchkiss and a Vickers, but they would have up to 9 machine guns in the tank designed as an anti-personnel. So you use the male tank to bust down obstacles. You use the female tank to kill enemy troops as you make the breakthrough. The Germans, for some reason, were very slow in developing their own tank. And you see the Sturmpanzerwagen that the Germans came up with, and it wasn't very effective. Neither one proved to be the breakthrough weapon that they were looking for. So as the United States sits on the sidelines and watches the horrific destruction of European manhood, they see millions dying on the battlefields. They don't want to be a part of this. So the question is, how did the United States get involved? And why did they make this leap into war when everything pointed at keeping out of this conflict, that it wasn't America's fight? Well, as the map shows, one of the key factors getting America involved is geography. Now, this particular map is a map of the transatlantic telegraph cables communicating from Europe to the United States. And what do you see with just the communication? All of it goes through the Allies. The Allies being Britain, France, Russia. Well, technically they're called the Entente. Entente being another name for agreement. So the 2 sides in World War I are the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, ultimately the Ottoman Empire, and then the Entente powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, and their associated powers. Now, the United States never joins the Entente. We are an associated power that fights alongside the Entente, but we don't become part of the Entente. But what you see is all the information coming from Europe passes through Great Britain or France. And so the information the United States receives is never pro-German. It's always pro-British. The British edit out news that reflects poorly on Britain. British atrocities, British casualties are all downplayed, whereas German casualties, German barbarities are upplayed. But beyond communication, geography itself, the United States is neutral, and they want to trade with both sides. But if you look at the map, the Allies are in a strategic position, the Entente is in a strategic position to prevent Germany from gaining access to the United States. Especially once Britain declares a naval blockade on Germany, shutting off access to the North Sea from the British merchant fleet, and any ship that dares to leave and travel through that area is going to be captured or sunk by the British Navy, and in essence going to starve Germany into submission. And so with the British fleet and the British Air Service, preventing German transports from getting to the United States. Most of the U.S. trade and U.S. banking and U.S. interest is going to be pointed toward Great Britain and France. Now, that's not to say with the blockade in place, which, by the way, Germany, repeatedly screamed that the blockade was illegal, but Germany tried to find ways around it. And so as they began trading with the United States, since they can't get ships there, they devise a new classification of submarine called the merchant sub. And you see pictures of one of those on the top and to the side, the Deutschland, and it coming to Baltimore Harbor to trade. But you see the problem with that sub in the picture on the top. Compare the Deutschland to the merchant ship anchored next to it. It can only carry a fraction of the cargo. And so Germany is going to be extremely limited in the amount of trade that it can conduct because of the blockade. And so it does what it can, but it's not going to be starved out. And so to retaliate, the Germans use the one weapon that they have to effectively answer the blockade, and that's the U-boat. Now, the Navy protects its capital ships with destroyers and submarine hunting ships, so they're not able to go after British capital ships with regularity, but the U-boats were declared, and Kaiser Wilhelm declares a submarine blockade of the British Isles. So British ships engaged in commerce with the United States are going to have to then travel through submarine-infested waters to get back to England. And this is going to pose a huge problem. The U.S. shipping traveling to Britain has to travel through submarines and the British Navy to trade with anyone. And so the United States, while being way off out west, is kind of caught in the middle of the conflict. Whereas most Americans see the war as a family quarrel, it's very quickly going to involve the United States. During the first months of 1915, German submarine warfare sank about 90 British ships in the war zone, the area around the British Isles where they had declared a no-sail zone. One of those ships, the RMS Falaba, sunk on March 28, 1915, would be the first would have on board the first American killed in the conflict. His last name, by the way, was Thrasher, and so the sinking of the Falaba is often called the Thrasher incident. But with the death of Mr. Thrasher, the U.S. suffers its first loss, and of course, the U.S. government protested, but it was just one individual, and he was on a British ship, so, no harm, no foul. But then in May 1st, 1915, a U.S. tanker carrying gasoline and fuel oil from Port Arthur, Texas, sailing to the British Isles, the SS Gulf Light, is torpedoed by a German U-boat. The torpedo impacts, but the ship doesn't explode, but begins to sink. And so the captain, who, by the way, there will be 3 Americans killed on the Gulf Light, one of them being the captain of the ship. He has a heart attack. 2 other guys abandoned ship and drowned. They order the ship abandoned, but when the ship ultimately doesn't sink, they reboard the ship and they're able to do counter flooding and make it to port, only to have the Gulf Light sink. I believe it was sunk much later in the war, but the Gulf Light will survive this incident, but with 3 Americans dead. Now, when the United States demanded of the German government a response as to why they sank or attempted to sink an American ship, they were told that the escorting vessels were British, and they were. There were British cruisers near the Gulf Light, near meaning within 5 miles of it, but not really close to it. And the Gulf Light was not flying any country-specific flag that they could see. It was only after torpedoing the ship and seeing the name of it that they realized it was an American ship, and the U-boat captain broke off contact, doing everything he can not to draw America into the conflict. You have to give the Germans some due here. They weren't wholesale targeting Americans. Accidents happened. But once again, American outrage at an American ship being torpedoed and 3 Americans being killed. And so Woodrow Wilson orders a series of stern notes sent to the Germans demanding that they cease and desist, while at the same time Wilson proclaimed American innocence. But the Gulf Light incident will soon be overshadowed by the sinking of an even more high-profile target, the Lusitania. The Lusitania will be sunk on May 7th, just days after the Gulf Light attack, May 7th, 1915. There will be 1,198 people killed in the sinking of the Lusitania, and along with those, 128, amongst those killed, 128 Americans. Seen as a horrific loss of life, Americans demanded answers from the Germans. This is not entirely fair. As you see in the newspaper ad on the side advertising the sailing of the Cunard Line ship Lusitania, which, by the way, at the time of its sailing was the fastest ship on the seas. It was declared by its makers, it was a brand new ship, just out of the slips. It was the fastest ship sailing, and it was considered unsinkable. Unsinkable because the ship was filled with watertight compartments that could be sealed at a moment's notice, isolating any damage and preventing it from sinking. But the problem is, as you see in the newspaper ad, that ship is traveling from America to Great Britain, and as they post the sailing times, the German government buys the section right below the sailing times, and they put in a notice. This ship is sailing into a war zone. You sail on this ship at your own risk. Nonetheless, 128 Americans decide to sail on the Lusitania. So Captain William Turner, captain of the Lusitania, set sail as planned. The ship was considered faster, by the way, so fast that it could outrun a torpedo. And it well may have been, but on that fateful day of May 7th, when German U-boat number 20, German U-20, under Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, sees the Lusitania, he fires a spread of torpedoes. A spread is usually 3. He fires a spread of torpedoes. For some reason, a lookout on the Lusitania saw the torpedo up to 2 miles away, saw the wake of the torpedo, and nobody reacted. They called for the captain to come on deck, and by the time the Lusitania reacted to the torpedo, it was too close to avoid. The torpedo struck the Lusitania, and by the way, they could, it happened all the time in World War II. The way to avoid a torpedo is you turn into. If the torpedo is coming at you and you're sailing along this way, one of the ways to avoid the torpedo is you turn into it, prevents a more narrow profile instead of the large broadside, and then you can see it and you can maneuver out of its path. They didn't have intelligent torpedoes in the day. The torpedo was, certainly a fire and forget. It's going to travel along a designated course. But the first torpedo impacted, bringing the Lusitania to a halt and opening enough of the side of the Lusitania to overbalance the Lusitania, and as it flooded on one side, all of those sealed compartments didn't allow for the counter flooding to keep the Lusitania upright. And so as one side filled with water, the Lusitania simply rolled over and sank. America was outraged. They demanded a response. Germany said, hey, we warned you. We told you not to sail on the Lusitania. And anyway, the Lusitania was a legitimate war target. It was a legitimate war target because it was not a civilian vessel. Germany said that the Lusitania was carrying arms and ammunition, contraband, which made it a legitimate war target. Regardless of how many passengers you put on it, if you carry ammunition or anything listed on the contraband list, then it's a legitimate war target. And despite British denials, Germany insisted it was a legitimate target, but the world wasn't listening. Ironically, in the 1990s, divers dove on the Lusitania and managed to get a ROV, a remote operated vehicle, inside the cargo hold of the Lusitania. And guess what they discovered? 4,200 cases of small arms ammunition stored in the steerage compartments and in the cargo holds of this passenger ship. The British were using passenger ships, believing the Germans would not sink those ships. And so while Americans are rightly outraged, there was little that Germany could do to assuage that risk, that outrage. President Wilson ordered even more harsh diplomatic notes dispatched, so harsh, in fact, that Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan said, that's it, I quit. William Jennings Bryan, being a pacifist, said, you're trying to get us into this war, and I don't agree with it. So William Jennings Bryan steps aside. Secretary of State Robert Lansing then becomes the chief negotiator, and they send what amounts to an ultimatum to Germany: stop unrestricted warfare or else. This was given further impetus when on August of 1915, the SS Arabic was torpedoed. Once again, with 3 Americans being killed. And then in March of 1916, the French ship, the Sussex, torpedoed by U-29 in the English Channel. Only 1 American was involved, and I don't even think he was killed, just injured, but it was the fact that it was a merchant ship torpedo. Well, the Sussex was really a ferry. It wasn't even a merchant ship. It was a ferry, and it was traveling through the English Channel, but U-29 fired the torpedo in the fog, just seeing the silhouette and thinking it was a merchant ship. And of course, it blew off the bow of the ship that you see there. And so Germany is forced by pressure from the United States to back away from unrestricted submarine warfare. And that allowed for the presidential election of 1916. President Woodrow Wilson is going to seek re-election based on his progressive platform, but more importantly, and I put 4 buttons around the slide to illustrate and for you to see, Woodrow Wilson runs on a campaign of, he kept us out of war. Bragging about his not responding to the attacks on Americans on vessels that would lead to war. In fact, Woodrow Wilson said, if you elect Charles Evans Hughes, the United States will be in World War II in 6 months. In fact, Woodrow Wilson is going to win on Election Day, and the United States will be in World War I in 6 months. So, November 1916, Woodrow Wilson wins the re-election as president with substantive changes in the cabinet, especially with the change at Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and his all-important Secretary of War Newton Baker. Newton Baker is going to be the architect of American involvement in World War I. And I think the great thing about Newton Baker is that even though he's Secretary of War, he knew he didn't know everything, and so he listened to the American generals as they told him what they needed on the battlefield. But the United States is at the precipice. Diplomatic relations with Germany is shaky at best, but with the German pledge to not continue unrestricted submarine warfare and no direct threats to the United States, it appears that Woodrow Wilson is going to be able to live up to his pledge that the United States can stay out of war. That is going to prove impossible, though, when documents were discovered linking the German government to attempts to bring Mexico into the conflict. In January 1917, Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress and declares to the warring parties that they should accept peace without victory, and demanding that Britain, France, Germany, Austria all come to the negotiating tables and be willing to end the conflict. Unbeknownst by Wilson, Germany was performing a cost-benefit analysis of its own, and it realized that in 1917 it had the resources for one major push. And they believed that they could knock France out of the war before the United States could get involved if they could shut off enough shipping from the United States. And so in early 1917, Germany is going to announce to the world that it is going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And then documents are found on a train delivered to the United States from the British consulate. In this briefcase that they found was a telegram, and they decode the telegram. It was a German code that they had broken. It was a telegram from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government. And it said, in effect, that the United States was willing to cut a deal. On February 25th, 1917, the document was made public. And in the document, the Germans offer Mexico California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas if, in the event of war, and the United States declaring war on Germany, if Mexico will declare war on the United States, they don't have to win, just keep the United States occupied so that Germany can win in Europe. And then at the peace tables, they will ensure that Mexico is properly rewarded with those former Mexican territories restored. Now, Mexico, this would have been a horrific thing for Mexico. Already, Mexico is struggling. They have drawn closer to Germany over the past decade or two. But if they had gotten involved with this, if they had exercised it, Mexico would have been stomped, and ultimately, maybe not, American involvement in Europe wins the war. It definitely does without Mexico, but maybe it distracts the United States longer. We just don't know. Mexico didn't have a big enough army, though, to really tie down substantial numbers of U.S. troops. And so Mexico had declined anyway, but the Zimmerman telegram, as it came to be called, inflamed American passions. A second event that occurs in March of 1917 that moves Wilson toward intervention is a revolution in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution takes place, and the Tsar is toppled as the head of Russia. The Bolsheviks immediately appeal to Germany for an end to the conflict. And in the negotiations, Germany imposes a huge indemnity on Russia, taking huge chunks of Russian territory, but agreeing to end the war with Russia. What that means is all of those divisions now on the Eastern Front are going to transfer to the Western Front, so that by late 1917 or early 1918, Germany's going to have overwhelming force. And so with that, Wilson is having to consider further action, and then this is compounded by a third event. Once again, a German U-boat torpedoing a ship. On April 2nd, 1917, 2 weeks after German unrestricted submarine warfare resumes, 3 American ships are torpedoed. The ship you see there, Laconia, is British. But it pushed Wilson to the point that he's going to ask for a declaration of war. He spoke these words to Congress, and I quote, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have their voice in their own government, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." This war is going to be called the Great War by those who participated in it. Later, after World War II begins, it will be called World War I. But Wilson refers to it repeatedly as the war to end wars. The war to end all wars. That this is the last conflict that civilized humans are going to fight, because now the United States is involved, and we're going to make the world safe for democracy and safe for people to have a say in their governments. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. Wilson has to convince the American people that going to war is the right thing now, after 3 years of telling them, remain neutral in heart as well as mind. But we'll pick up there next time.